Hey drum friends, Jay here. I got recently the Alesis SamplePad Pro, and I'm going to do a little review of it today. So maybe you're a drummer like me, you've been looking around and going, oh, there are a lot of electronic drum sounds, like how does all of this stuff work and what does it take to get into all of this kind of stuff? And you saw the Roland SPD and you were like, oh, $900, like that sounds like a great idea to spend money on. I mean, who has that kind of money anyways? So I came across the Alesis SamplePad 4 and I thought this would be a great entry level into getting into triggers, into pads and all that stuff. But it was $180 and I just thought, you know, can I just look around and find anything better or anything closer? So then I found the Alesis SamplePad Pro used for $200, thought let's go with it, and it's been a great investment. I'd recommend getting used, works the exact same, do it. So I won't go into too much detail about features because you can download a manual, you can see what kinds of stuff it can do. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on 5 things that I've learned about how I can use my Alesis SamplePad Pro and kind of do it in 3 good things and 2 things that you should be aware of. It's sort of like a feedback sandwich, but like a club sandwich. Bacon. Alright, so number 1, I'll talk about loops. So of course you can put any type of sounds you want into here. There's also different modes where you can have it be polyrhythmic or monorhythmic. And so the other thing that you can do when you hit a pad is you can just have it to endlessly loop. So before, I would have this whole setup where I would have, you know, a 4x4 set of pads that I would click, and then it would go into Ableton and control of the stuff, but I'd have to lug around a computer, I'd have to lug around an interface, a table to put it all on, and it was just a giant mess. Whereas with looping, I can put it directly into the SamplePad Pro and then just have it loop automatically for me, no other hardware needed. And so for one of the groups that I would gig with, we would play to a click for an entire 4 minutes, just so that right at the bridge we could get 10 seconds of a banjo sample. I'd much rather bring just one device, the SamplePad Pro, and not have to lug around my interface, table, computer, all just to get that little short window there. So that's kind of a novel use for loops, but another thing that I was sort of imagining is just having a lot of different drum sounds. Like I like EDM kind of stuff and also hip hop where, you know, you have one drum sound and then if you were to have the last measure of a phrase, it would switch to a whole different set of sounds like toms or have reverb or something like that, and then it switched right back to the A version of all the different pads and sounds that you had. And so since the sample pad has all of these different sets that you can use, I thought it would be easy enough to just reach over, switch one for a measure, switch back, have a bunch of different sounds, and it would be cool. But it turns out that it takes a long time to load each of the different sets. So here's the deal. There are a bunch of different sounds built into the sample pad, and if you use those, the sets switch automatically and they just load seamlessly. But if you load your own samples on an SD card onto the device, it takes up to 4 seconds per megabyte to load. And that really adds up pretty quick. So for the most part, you know, just like a clap or like snare drum sound, it's, you know, anywhere from 0.2 megabytes to a half a megabyte. But still, it's not the quick changeover that you would hope that you could switch between different sets. So there's also this foot switch input here where you can have something to set an A, B, or left, right, and then you can just toggle through all of your different sets. So now knowing how long it takes to load each of those different sets, I probably just won't even bother and I'll just reach over, hit a button during a song change. I know how long it'll take and I can just plan that into my set, anticipate when I would have to switch, or just pack all of the different sounds that I need into one set so I don't have to switch it. So that's the case when you're trying to switch a set. But if you're tweaking all of the different individual pads, there's a really cool feature that's changing the tuning. So using these navigation switches here, you can get to tuning, and you can get to pan, sensitivity, reverb, and volume level, all of which come really in handy when you're on site, because if you have something that isn't working really well, it's not cutting through the mix, it's too loud, too soft, or just not blending real well and you want to cover it up with a little bit of reverb, you can access all of that right here on the fly, real time. In another case, there was a pad that I was playing where it had a loop and it was just a synth pad, but the bass player started the song and he started 1 fret too high. It was no big deal. I just selected the pad, I went down to tune, and I put it up a half step to match what the bass player was playing, re-triggered, it was in the right key, no problem. I'll mention one other use case. I had a snare drum sound that was layering on top of my live snare drum, and it just wasn't cutting through the mix as much as I was hoping it would be. So then instead of having to, you know, get on a laptop, pull up the sample, work on it. So for that set, I just bumped it up 4 steps, punched through the mix as it was hoping for, and then we were all good to go for that day. It goes up to 4, by the way, a full 2 whole steps, or down 2 full whole steps. So that was definitely something that I was fearing, getting into all of this kind of programming and setting samples and stuff, getting quickly lost in the mechanics and all of the details and how all of the different pieces fit together and how all of it's loaded together and in the mix and balanced and all that. So having those easily accessible controls helped that process out a ton. So as I was kind of suggesting, number 4 is programming and getting all of the samples into the sample pad in the first place. So from what I've seen on YouTube, it does look like Roland has their own little file manager program that you can put on a computer. You can manage all of your samples, put them in the proper places, and then get your device off and running. But with the sample pad, all you have is just your SD card, and there are a couple specific restrictions of getting samples onto the sample pad that you should be aware of. So I guess first and foremost, it must be in a WAV format. Samples must be 16-bit. They can be mono or stereo. And then there are a number of different sample rates that it can have. However, a very important one is that it can only be up to 8 characters long, and you can't use any special characters. It just needs to be alphanumeric characters. So on one hand, this kind of makes sense because the display is only so big, you can only display so many characters of what the pad is, but in another sense, it makes it kind of difficult because if you have a giant stack of files on an SD card, how do you find them? How do you find them when you're trying to pull them up in the sample pad using only these buttons to select a file? So it gets a little tricky. So one thing I thought to do is come up with a template in Excel so that I could have all of my pads laid out. I could sort of think in my head where I wanted to put things first before I dive into a bunch of folder directories and look at samples and edit reverb and EQ and all of that stuff. And if you're interested, I went ahead and just made that in a public file through Dropbox, and I put that in a link in the description below, and you can see that there and download it. Tweak it however you'd like, but it's helped me stay focused and stay organized as I'm trying to just figure out what the heck I'm trying to put into this thing. And so basically the way I've made it work is that you have set 1, set 2, set 3, etc. And then you just make a list of all the different samples you want with room for a description, and then you have a space with only 6 characters, and then I've mapped it to all the different 8 pads so that you put your 6 characters here, and then it appends it with the pad that it's on. I just labeled it 1A, 1B, 1C, D, E, etc. But you can tweak the template to suit your needs and however you think of naming all the different pads on your SamplePad Pro or whatever. So number 5, I want to talk about DAW control a little bit. So when I got this, I was mainly thinking and hoping that it would just be a standalone product, which is more than exceeded my expectations for that. So I'm really grateful that I've picked this product to use. So most notably, there's a USB jack, which I've found it does work with Ableton, it does work with GarageBand, so that I can control different sets, and you can use MIDI mapping to have any of the pads edit anything that you want in Ableton, and then it does have a MIDI in and a MIDI out, which I've yet to experiment with a keyboard sound station to get time clocks syncing, but I think that should be something fairly easy to do. So you can use these to be control surfaces for hitting play, stop, selecting other scenes, stopping scenes, things like that. So those are my 5 tips, and I did want to talk a little bit to you if you're thinking about getting into one of these pads or buying something, a couple additional costs that you might not have thought of that you might need to think about. So the first one is, how do you set this up? Where do you put it? So as I mentioned, I have a table that I use for my laptop and for an interface, but I quickly realized that a sample pad really is another instrument that you want to hit. It is something that you want to have an easily accessible height, and then it should be in the right location that you can just conveniently hit it once you're playing everything else. So I did happen to have an extra snare drum stand lying around that I'm able to fit it around my sample pad. There are mounts available, but there's something on the order of like $90, $100, something like that, which you're already putting in $200 or even $300 on one of these things. So you could buy the plate that's designed by Alesis, or you could buy a snare drum stand. Something you just have to consider how you really want to be able to make this easy to play for you. Something that occurred to me while I was talking about me fiddling with all of my samples and stuff. I have an SD card, and I happen to have an SD card reader, and I have a digital audio workstation that I can manage and modify samples in. If you want to get into this stuff, there are built-in sounds that come with the pad. They also give you a link to download a free library of other sounds that you can use with the sample pad. I'm realizing it's a whole new world of just buying, downloading, and trying samples and modifying them. If you're looking for just some basic 808 sounds, that kind of thing, they're good. If you want to get beyond that, or if you even imagine you want to put things into there, you'll have to think about how you edit the clips, how you manage them, etc. And then one last thing that I'll sort of mention about if you want to use these pads, they do have external triggers available for inputs. You'll have to buy them. I was able to find some cheap $20 triggers that I've able to put on my snare drum and then on a bass drum. And there is something called mute groups if you want to read about that in the Alesis manual. Of course, that will be cables and that will be a trigger to put on your bass drum, so that adds up a little quickly too. So those are a couple things I've been learning about my Alesis SamplePad Pro, and I hope you learned a couple things or it's helped you in your search for buying this thing, or if you want to find a different product. And of course, there are always nuances to how this thing works and how I use it, and if you have any additional questions, I'd be happy to give you some feedback or some tips on what I've learned so far or my experiences using it. So feel free to comment below or shoot me a personal message or contact me some other way somehow, and I'd be happy to respond and keep the conversation going. Thanks, and have a good one. Bye.